The roar of battle pierces the early morning air, reverberating through the dense jungle of the Pacific Island. In the sweltering heat, the air seems to quiver with tension. The ground beneath shakes as massive artillery shells explode, sending plumes of smoke into the humid sky. A battle is raging, one that will change the course of the war. The soldiers on both sides are drenched in sweat, the sounds of gunfire and explosions incessant as the chaos of combat consumes the battlefield. Among the cacophony of sounds, there is another, more subtle noise. The hum of a machine, the steady crackle of radio transmissions. It is a sound often ignored by soldiers in the midst of battle, but in this moment it will prove to be a lifeline for some, a death knell for others. It is the technology that will soon alter the course of the Pacific War, the Sherman tank. A small group of Japanese officers stands in the shadow of a thick palm tree, watching the unfolding chaos. They are on edge, their faces tense with anticipation. These officers, highly trained and well-versed in the art of war, are unaware that their greatest adversary does not lie in the tanks they see charging across the battlefield, but rather in something far more invisible, the radios inside those tanks, radios that they have never encountered before. These radios, though a seemingly minor part of the tank's formidable presence, will prove to be one of the most advanced technological advantages the Americans have. In the early hours of that fateful day, the Japanese soldiers are caught between two worlds, the harsh, unforgiving terrain of the island, and the brutal realization that their battle tactics, once so effective, are now being outpaced by innovation. The Americans, with their superior radios, are coordinating and striking with a precision that is overwhelming. As the battle unfolds before them, the Japanese officers cannot yet comprehend the full implications of this unseen force. But soon they will. The island they are fighting over, a strategically important piece of real estate in the Pacific, will become the focal point of a shift in the balance of power. The technology embedded in the American Sherman tanks, specifically their advanced radios, will be a key player in this transformation. What was once a relatively minor advantage will soon prove itself to be decisive. This is a battle not just for control of the island, but for the future of the Pacific theater of war. And as the day wears on, the Japanese officers will begin to realize that the tides of war may not be as easily controlled as they once believed. To understand the significance of the Sherman tank's advanced radios in the Pacific theater, one must first look at the broader geopolitical context of the time. The year is 1943, and the world is embroiled in the most devastating conflict it has ever seen: World War II. On one side, the Allied powers, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, are locked in a battle for survival against the Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. By 1943, the United States had become the primary force in the Pacific theater, following Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The attack had thrust the United States into the war and set the stage for a series of brutal battles across the vast Pacific Ocean. From the desolate sands of the Aleutian Islands to the jungles of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, the Allied forces were engaged in an unrelenting push to repel Japanese expansion. The Japanese, meanwhile, had been advancing aggressively across the Pacific since their initial victories in the early days of the war. By the time the Americans entered the fray, Japan controlled a significant portion of the Pacific, including the Philippines, Guam, and the Mariana Islands. These territories were critical to Japan's war strategy, both as a source of resources and as military staging points for further operations. But by 1943, the tide of war was beginning to turn against Japan. After the pivotal Battle of Midway in 1942, the United States had begun to take the offensive, launching a series of island-hopping campaigns to recapture territory and drive the Japanese forces back. The strategy was simple but brutal. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held island, the Allies focused on capturing strategically important islands and using them as bases from which to launch further assaults. This not only weakened Japan's defensive perimeter, but also cut off vital supply lines. The Battle of the Philippines Sea in June 1944, where the Americans decisively defeated the Japanese fleet, further crippled Japan's ability to defend its territory. The Japanese Imperial Navy, once a formidable force, had been shattered, leaving the Japanese army to fight with limited resources. While these military engagements were taking place, another significant development was underway. The technological race was heating up, and the United States, with its vast industrial capacity, was at the forefront of innovation. The Sherman tank, which had already proven its effectiveness on the European front, was now being adapted for the Pacific theater. But it wasn't just the firepower of the tank that would make the difference. It was the radios inside them that would change the game. In the heat of battle, the ability to communicate rapidly and effectively with fellow units and commanders was crucial. The Sherman tanks, equipped with advanced radios, allowed the American forces to coordinate their movements with unprecedented precision. This was in stark contrast to the Japanese forces, who lacked similar communication technology. Their reliance on more traditional methods of communication, runners, field phones, and signal flags, proved to be inefficient and slow. As a result, the Japanese commanders often found themselves out of the loop, unable to react swiftly to the dynamic battlefield conditions. This communication gap would become evident in the brutal island battles that would follow. The Japanese, despite their courage and military experience, were caught in a technological chasm. While they had advanced weaponry, they were not prepared for the scale of American innovation, particularly in the field of communication. The radios inside the Sherman tanks, though seemingly small in comparison to the tank's massive guns and armor, would prove to be one of the most decisive factors in the Pacific War. As the battle for the islands continued, both sides would come to realize that war was no longer just a matter of brute force and willpower. Technology had become an equal player in the field of battle, and those who adapted to it the fastest would come out on top. The Japanese officers, who were at the heart of this struggle, were not blind to the American technological advancements. However, they had underestimated the role communication would play in the war. Their strategies, once effective on the battlefield, were now being undermined by their inability to keep pace with the rapidly advancing American technology. The Pacific War had reached a tipping point. While the Japanese forces were still formidable, they were now operating in a world where the technological superiority of the United States was beginning to shine through. The Sherman tanks, with their advanced radios, were a symbol of this new era of warfare, one in which communication could turn the tide of battle, and where the invisible forces of technology could shape the outcome of an entire war. As the battle in the Pacific rages on, it's crucial to understand the many different perspectives at play. The war was not only a clash of armies, but also a confrontation of ideologies, cultures, and technologies. For those fighting in it, the experience was deeply personal, emotionally charged, and shaped by unique pressures. By looking at the human, tactical, leadership, and enemy perspectives, we can begin to see how the American Sherman tanks' radios affected the battlefield in ways that transcended technology alone. For the soldiers on the ground, the fight in the Pacific was a brutal and unforgiving experience. The soldiers of the 1st Marine Division and the 27th Infantry Division, who found themselves charging through the dense jungles of islands like Tarawa and Saipan, were entrenched in a nightmarish landscape. The heat was unbearable, the humidity stifling. In the thick jungles, it was almost impossible to tell where the enemy might be hiding. The dense foliage offered no cover from the burning sun, and the sounds of the jungle were often drowned out by the deafening explosions and constant gunfire. Yet in the midst of this chaos, something seemingly small would make all the difference. The Sherman tanks, with their thick armor and powerful guns, rumbled through the battlegrounds, offering protection for the infantry and laying waste to Japanese defensive positions. But it was the radios inside those tanks that enabled the crews to coordinate their movements with pinpoint precision. For the soldiers inside those tanks, the radios were a lifeline. They provided a constant stream of communication with commanders, other tank crews, and infantry units. A soldier inside one of these tanks could relay information about enemy positions or request support, making their every action more effective. Yet, the emotional toll was immense. The constant fear of enemy fire, the relentless noise of battle, and the claustrophobic environment inside the tanks left little room for comfort. The radios, though, helped maintain a sense of order in the madness. allowing them to make sense of the chaos and respond accordingly. On the other side of the line, the Japanese soldiers faced a different but no less harrowing reality. They had fought fiercely in the Pacific for years, and now they were up against an enemy with superior technology. The Japanese soldiers too had radios, but they were not as advanced as the American models. Many times they struggled to communicate across the battlefield. This delay in communication proved to be a critical disadvantage, particularly when American tanks with their advanced radios were able to reposition quickly, relay artillery coordinates, or warn of impending attacks, while the Japanese were still trying to connect with their units. The tactical advantage offered by the Sherman tank's advanced radios cannot be overstated. In any battle, communication is the linchpin that holds the entire operation together. The ability to coordinate movements, respond to threats in real time, and adapt to changing conditions can mean the difference between victory and defeat. For the United States, this meant they could approach every battle with a sense of cohesion and flexibility that the Japanese forces simply could not match. The Sherman tanks were the backbone of the American ground forces in the Pacific. Equipped with powerful radios that allowed them to transmit information over vast distances, these tanks became mobile command posts. With their superior communication systems, tank commanders were able to relay updates on enemy movements, request artillery support, and even call in airstrikes, all in real time. This allowed American forces to conduct highly coordinated, precision strikes on Japanese positions, cutting through enemy defenses with devastating efficiency. In contrast, the Japanese forces were still relying on older, more traditional methods of communication. They used runners, flag signals, and field telephones, but these methods were often too slow or unreliable, particularly in the fast-paced, chaotic conditions of the Pacific theater. Japanese officers frequently found themselves out of the loop, unable to react to American maneuvers quickly enough to mount a defense. This communication gap, along with the increasing technological superiority of the Americans, turned the tide in many of the Pacific's most critical battles. From the standpoint of leadership, the success of the Sherman tank's advanced radios in the Pacific came down to the decisions made by American commanders. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied forces in the Pacific, and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, both understood the strategic value of communication. Their foresight in equipping American tanks with the latest radio technology gave them a decisive advantage over the Japanese. However, the Japanese leadership, particularly in the Imperial Army, was slow to adapt to the changing dynamics of modern warfare. They had relied heavily on traditional strategies that emphasized bold attacks and battlefield tactics. While these strategies had worked in the early years of the war, they were now being undermined by the technological advancements of the Americans. General Hideki Tojo, the Prime Minister of Japan and a key figure in military strategy, was known for his aggressive leadership style. Yet, despite his leadership, the Japanese military was unable to adapt quickly enough to the technological revolution unfolding on the battlefield. The Japanese forces were now facing an adversary that not only outnumbered them, but was also outclassing them technologically, and the gap would continue to widen. From the enemy's perspective, the Japanese soldiers were faced with the daunting task of fighting against an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. The Japanese had long relied on their formidable ground forces, including the Imperial Army and Navy, to hold their positions. However, the American strategy of island hopping, coupled with superior communication and technology, meant that the Japanese were slowly being surrounded. The Japanese had initially underestimated the role that radios would play in modern warfare. They viewed tanks primarily as formidable weapons of destruction, but they did not fully comprehend the importance of the radio systems that powered them. The radios inside the American Sherman tanks allowed the U.S. forces to maintain constant communication, giving them the flexibility to quickly shift forces, coordinate attacks, and call in reinforcements. This made the Japanese forces vulnerable, as their own communication systems were slow, fragmented, and prone to failure. The inability to keep up with the American technological edge proved to be a fatal flaw for the Japanese. Their traditional tactics, which had once been so effective, were now outpaced by the speed and precision of American radio-coordinated operations. The battle for the Pacific had already seen its fair share of brutal clashes, but nothing would prepare the world for what would unfold when the full force of American technological superiority came to bear on the Japanese defenses. The turning point of the battle, though shaped by the might of artillery, infantry, and air superiority, would ultimately be determined by the radio waves crackling through the Sherman tanks. This seemingly simple yet critical innovation would shift the momentum in the Pacific theater and mark the beginning of the end for Japan's imperial ambitions. The turning point occurred during the Battle of Saipan in June 1944, one of the most pivotal engagements in the Pacific. Saipan was a key island in the Mariana Islands chain, and its capture was essential for the Americans to secure a launch pad for their B-29 bombers, which were now capable of striking Japan's home islands. The Japanese, on the other hand, viewed Saipan as an essential stronghold, a place that could help them maintain their control over the Pacific. The island was heavily fortified. The Japanese had dug in deep, constructing elaborate defensive positions, gun emplacements, and bunkers. The terrain was challenging: steep hills, dense jungles, and a coastline littered with coral reefs and rocky outcrops. It seemed like a formidable challenge for the Americans. Despite their superior numbers and firepower, the Allies would face fierce resistance from the Japanese defenders, who were prepared to fight to the last man. As the battle began, the American forces, including infantry, Marines, and tank battalions, slowly began to push inland. The Japanese, though surrounded, fought with fierce tenacity, using the terrain to their advantage. But as the fighting raged on, something changed on the battlefield. A subtle yet significant shift that would begin to turn the tide in favor of the Americans. It wasn't just the brute force of artillery or the overwhelming power of American firepower. It was the Sherman tanks with their advanced radios that began to make the real difference. Up until this moment, the Americans had used tanks primarily as support for infantry operations. The tanks provided fire support, breaking through the Japanese defenses, but it was their radio systems that allowed American forces to maintain fluidity on the battlefield. The radios allowed tank commanders to call in airstrikes, artillery bombardments, and reinforcements at critical junctures. This level of coordination was unheard of in the Japanese forces, who struggled to communicate effectively across their lines. In the heat of battle, the difference became stark. The Japanese, whose communication systems relied on runners and outdated radios, found themselves constantly reacting to American moves, rather than dictating the flow of the engagement. As American tanks rumbled through the battle lines, their radios transmitting constantly to higher command, the Japanese defenses were systematically overwhelmed. The tanks not only breached the strong points, but they also coordinated attacks with artillery and air support, hammering away at the Japanese positions with relentless precision. In one particularly intense moment, as the Japanese attempted to mount a counterattack on the American lines, a Sherman tank commander, using his advanced radio, was able to call in air support, which decimated the attacking force. Without the tank's radio, the Japanese attack might have gained ground. But the rapid coordination of American forces, facilitated by the radio, turned the tide almost immediately. This turning point was not just about technological superiority. It was about the psychological impact it had on both sides. The Japanese soldiers, who had fought with great resolve and valor, were now confronted with an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move. The psychological strain of fighting an opponent who was always one step ahead began to take its toll. As the Americans continued to coordinate their movements with flawless precision, the Japanese defenders, once confident in their strongholds, began to falter. Meanwhile, American troops, buoyed by their ability to communicate efficiently, pushed forward with a sense of purpose and resolve. The Sherman tank's radio had done more than just relay information. It had become the symbol of American adaptability and innovation. The radio was not just a piece of technology. It was the thread that tied together every element of the American military machine. It allowed commanders to remain flexible, to exploit weaknesses in the Japanese defenses, and to respond to the shifting conditions of battle. For the Japanese, the realization of their communication deficiencies became painfully clear. They could no longer rely on their old methods of battle, and the gap in technology between the two forces widened. The radios inside the Sherman tanks allowed the Americans to keep their forces in constant motion, while the Japanese, weighed down by outdated technology, struggled to react in time. By the time the battle for Saipan reached its climax, the American forces had gained control of the island. It was a hard-fought victory, but one that would have lasting consequences. The Sherman tanks, with their advanced radios, had played a crucial role in ensuring that the American forces were always one step ahead. This battle was a microcosm of the broader war, a war in which technological innovation, particularly in communication, would prove to be a decisive factor. As the smoke cleared over Saipan, the outcome was evident. The United States had secured another important victory in the Pacific, and the Japanese had suffered another devastating blow. But the real story of Saipan wasn't just about the physical devastation of war. It was about how technology had begun to reshape the battlefield. The Sherman tank's radio had transformed the way war was fought, and it was clear that this would be a critical factor in the battles to come. The victory at Saipan was not just another island conquest. It marked a pivotal moment in the Pacific War, one that would resonate for years to come. For the American forces, the Battle of Saipan was not merely a military triumph. It was a demonstration of the immense power that technological superiority could bring to the battlefield. The advanced radios inside the Sherman tanks, once a mere tool for communication, had proven themselves to be a decisive advantage in the war's most brutal and unforgiving theater. The immediate consequences of Saipan's fall were profound. For the United States, the island was a crucial step in the strategy of island hopping that would lead them closer to Japan's home islands. Saipan's capture gave the Americans a forward base for launching B-29 Superfortress bombers, which could now carry out bombing raids on Japan itself. This, in turn, set the stage for the destruction of key Japanese cities, including Tokyo. The psychological blow to the Japanese war effort was immense. Losing Saipan meant losing a strategic foothold in the Pacific, and it marked the beginning of a rapid deterioration of Japanese morale. For the Japanese, the loss of Saipan was a devastating setback. The island was one of their last major strongholds in the Pacific, and its fall signified the collapse of their defensive perimeter. The Japanese military had long relied on the concept of the unassailable fortress, the belief that they could create impregnable defenses that would repel any invasion. But at Saipan, the Sherman tanks, with their advanced radios, shattered that illusion. The radios had enabled the American forces to maintain constant communication and coordination, turning the tide of battle in their favor. Moreover, the loss of Saipan marked a psychological turning point for the Japanese people. The island's capture by the Americans was a clear sign that the war was no longer just happening in distant, far-flung territories. It was now moving ever closer to Japan's home islands. The very technology that had allowed the United States to communicate and coordinate so effectively on the battlefield also sent a message to the Japanese government and citizens. The enemy had the power to wage war not just on land, but in ways that they could not anticipate or counter. The technological gap between the American and Japanese forces had now become glaringly obvious. The Japanese military had relied heavily on traditional tactics and weaponry, but the radios in the American Sherman tanks, which allowed for real-time communication across the battlefield, had proved to be a game-changer. The tanks were more than just weapons of war. They were a symbol of how the battlefield was evolving into a contest not only of strength and tactics, but of innovation. For the American forces, the victory at Saipan and the successful use of the Sherman tanks' advanced radios became a model for future operations in the Pacific. The lessons learned on Saipan would be applied to the subsequent campaigns in the Mariana Islands and beyond, where the Americans would continue to rely on technological advancements to maintain their edge. The tanks, now equipped with radios capable of maintaining constant communication with air and artillery support, became more than just a piece of military equipment. They were the embodiment of the new face of warfare. For the Japanese, however, the consequences were not limited to the battlefield. In the wake of Saipan's fall, the leadership in Tokyo found itself struggling to maintain control over the direction of the war. The Japanese military had been dealt a major blow, and with each subsequent loss, it became clear that their ability to resist the American advance was waning. The Japanese strategy of using heavy fortifications and isolated, Fierce resistance was no longer enough to withstand the rapid advancements in American military technology and coordination. Despite their courage and resolve, the Japanese forces could not keep pace with the evolving nature of the war. As the American tanks rolled forward, bolstered by their radios, the Japanese defensive lines continued to crumble. The once feared Imperial Army was now fighting a losing battle, outmatched not just by firepower, but by the precision and speed of American communication and coordination. In this new war, technology was becoming as decisive a factor as firepower, and the Japanese were at a severe disadvantage. The fall of Saipan, while a critical turning point, was just the beginning of a series of events that would eventually lead to Japan's defeat. In the months that followed, the American forces, now emboldened by their successes in the Pacific and equipped with superior technology, would continue their advance toward Japan's home islands. The technological advantage that had been cemented with the radios inside the Sherman tanks would be further refined and expanded upon, making it even more difficult for the Japanese to mount any effective resistance. The broader consequences of this turning point were also felt in the strategic decisions that followed. The United States began to increase its focus on precision airstrikes, leveraging its advanced communication networks to coordinate attacks on strategic Japanese targets. The B-29 bombers, now able to strike Japan directly, wreaked havoc on Japanese industrial centers and civilian infrastructure. The American strategy of sustained aerial bombardment, combined with the relentless island-hopping campaign, eventually forced Japan into a corner, with nowhere left to retreat. The Battle of Saipan and the technological innovations that shaped it marked a critical juncture in the Pacific War. The radios inside the Sherman tanks, once a mere tool of communication, had proven to be the key to unlocking the success of the island-hopping strategy. They allowed the American forces to maintain unparalleled coordination, making it possible for them to overwhelm the Japanese forces despite the latter's tenacity and defensive capabilities. The impact of this battle and the role of technology in it reverberated throughout the rest of the war, leaving a lasting imprint on the way warfare would be conducted in the future. As Saipan's beaches grew quiet and the smoke of battle dissipated, the world stood on the edge of a new era in warfare. Technology, which had once been a secondary consideration in combat, had now become the central force shaping the outcome of the war. The Japanese, who had once believed in the invincibility of their fortified islands, now realized that the very technology they had ignored, the radios inside American tanks, had shifted the balance of power in the Pacific, and ultimately, in the world. As the dust settled over the Pacific and the intense battles that followed Saipan unfolded, the world slowly began to take stock of what had transpired. The events of that summer, and the strategic innovations behind the Sherman tanks' radios, would ultimately shape the future of military operations for decades to come. It was a turning point in the evolution of warfare, not just on the battlefield, but in the way wars were fought, managed, and won. The technological innovations seen in the Pacific War, particularly those involving communication and coordination, would lay the groundwork for future military conflicts and influence the development of modern warfare. The success of the Sherman tanks' radios proved to be a demonstration of just how critical communication was to the success of military operations. The radios allowed for real-time coordination between tank crews, infantry, artillery units, and even air support. This seamless integration of various arms of the military was revolutionary. It made possible a level of flexibility and efficiency on the battlefield that had been previously unthinkable. No longer would armies have to rely on runners or field phones, methods that were slow and prone to failure. Instead, radio communication would form the backbone of modern military coordination. As the Pacific War moved forward, the lessons learned from the successful use of radios in the Sherman tanks would continue to influence military strategy. The island-hopping campaign, which had been so successful due to its ability to synchronize the movements of various military branches, became the model for future military operations. In essence, the ability to communicate quickly and accurately transformed the concept of combined arms warfare, where different military branches work together in coordinated efforts, into a more integrated, efficient force. The psychological impact of the Sherman tank's radios also had far-reaching effects. The soldiers who fought in the Pacific, particularly those manning the tanks, were acutely aware of the power of communication. The radios inside their vehicles allowed them to become part of a larger, more powerful machine, one that was capable of responding to threats instantly and adjusting to the ever-changing dynamics of battle. For the American forces, this ability to control the pace of the battle and react quickly to emerging threats not only boosted morale, but allowed them to fight with greater confidence and precision. For the Japanese, the fall of Saipan and the realization of their technological disadvantage had a profound impact. The Japanese military, once a formidable force in the Pacific, found itself outclassed by an adversary that had harnessed the power of modern communication to its advantage. The Japanese had relied heavily on traditional methods of warfare, and they struggled to adapt to the new realities of technological warfare. The Sherman tank's radios symbolized the broader shift in the Pacific War. The battle was no longer just about firepower, but about who could harness the latest technologies to gain a strategic advantage. The use of advanced radio systems in tanks also spoke to a larger trend in global warfare: the increasing reliance on technology to shape military outcomes. World War II was the first conflict in which technological advances, such as radar, aircraft carriers, and tanks, played a central role in determining the direction of battles. But it was the use of communication technologies like radios that truly transformed how armies coordinated and fought wars. As technology continued to advance in the post-war years, the lessons learned in the Pacific would serve as a guiding principle for military forces worldwide. In the decades that followed, the importance of communication in warfare only grew. The advent of new technologies like satellite communication, digital radios, and global positioning systems, GPS, would continue to evolve the way militaries operate. These technologies allowed for even greater precision and coordination, enabling modern armies to respond to threats with incredible speed and accuracy. The innovations pioneered during World War II, particularly in terms of battlefield communication, would continue to shape military strategy and operations for generations. Beyond the military sphere, the use of advanced communication technologies during World War II had lasting effects on civilian life. Many of the technologies that were developed for wartime use, including radar, jet propulsion, and computer technology, found their way into the civilian world after the war. The innovations that helped the United States and its allies win the war also helped to usher in an era of technological advancement that would change the course of history. The post-war world would see the rise of the information age, where communication and technology would play an ever more central role in shaping the global landscape. But perhaps the most profound impact of the Sherman tanks and their radios was the way they reshaped the way soldiers viewed war. For those who fought in the Pacific, the Sherman tank became a symbol of technological prowess and resilience. It represented not just the power of American industry, but the ability to adapt and innovate in the face of adversity. The tank crews, who relied on their radios to stay connected and coordinate with their comrades, understood that their success was not just a result of their own bravery, but of the superior technology that gave them the edge. In the years after World War II, the veterans who had served in the Pacific reflected on the experiences that had shaped their lives. Many spoke of the camaraderie they shared with their fellow soldiers, the hardships they endured, and the lessons they learned. But they also recognized the critical role that technology had played in their victories. The Sherman tanks and their radios had been the key to much of their success, allowing them to communicate across the chaos of battle and coordinate efforts with unparalleled efficiency. As the decades passed, the legacy of the Sherman tanks and their radios would live on, not just in the history of the war, but in the way warfare was conducted in the years to come. The technological advances that began in the trenches of the Pacific would shape the future of military strategy, creating a new era in which technology would be as important as tactics, and communication would be the lifeblood of military operations. The Battle of Saipan, and the role that radios played in the Sherman tanks, would be remembered as one of the critical moments in the Pacific War. It was a battle where innovation, technology, and communication came together to turn the tide of history. And in the end, it was the radios inside those tanks small, invisible yet utterly transformative, that helped change the course of the war and ultimately the world.